I never thought a routine clinic visit would turn into something far beyond a simple checkup. It was just supposed to be one of those days, you know? In and out, no fuss. But from the moment I stepped inside that exam room, the air around me felt charged, like something was just waiting to happen. The room itself was as you'd expect. Sterile, cold, and way too bright with that unforgiving white paint they always seem to use. The antiseptic smell was inescapable, lingering in the air like a constant reminder that you were in a place of procedure. I sat there on the crinkling paper that covered the exam table, waiting. It had been too long since my last checkup, and I was finally getting around to it. No big deal, right? Just routine. At first, everything felt normal. The nurse had come in earlier, cheerful and professional. She seemed to be about my age, mid-20s maybe. Sharp eyes, easy smile. She asked the usual questions, typed up her notes on the tablet, and told me to wait for the doctor. I remember thinking how everything felt so predictably dull. That was before things started to change. When she came back a few minutes later, the atmosphere was different. I could feel it before I even saw her. The way her steps seemed softer, slower, like she was more deliberate now. Her eyes lingered on me in a way that wasn't exactly typical. At first I figured I was imagining it. But when she moved closer to the exam table, something shifted between us. Something I could not quite put my finger on. She stood close, closer than before, and as she reached out to take my pulse, her fingers brushed against my arm. The touch was light, innocent enough on the surface, but it sent a jolt through me, like a spark igniting something I had not been prepared for. It should have been nothing. It was just a part of the routine, right? But the way her fingers lingered for just a beat too long told me otherwise. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. There was something there, hanging in the air, something unspoken but undeniably present. I could feel the tension building, a subtle but unmistakable shift that made my pulse quicken under her touch. "Go ahead and unbutton your pants," she said softly, her voice calm and professional. But there was a hint of something else in it, something that made my heart beat just a little faster. I hesitated for a second, not expecting the exam to get so personal so quickly. But I did as she asked, slowly undoing the button on my jeans and sliding down the zipper. My breath caught as I noticed her eyes fixed on me, watching closely, almost too closely. There was something about the way she looked at me now, something that made the air between us feel heavier, thicker. As I shifted on the table, unsure of what to do next, she stepped even closer, her fingers moving with a kind of deliberate care that sent a shiver down my spine. Her touch was light at first, but there was a purpose behind it, a subtle confidence that made my skin tingle under her fingertips. I glanced up at her, expecting her to look away or keep her expression neutral. But instead, her gaze was locked on mine, unwavering and filled with an intensity I hadn't noticed before. Her fingers brushed against my skin as she adjusted my waistband, her touch careful but lingering just a little longer than it should have. My breath hitched, and I could feel a knot of tension coil in my stomach, the anticipation of something I wasn't sure I should be feeling. She leaned in closer, her breath warm against my skin, and I could feel my pulse racing, not from nerves about the exam itself, but from the way she was making me feel. There was a moment of silence between us, the kind that stretches out forever and yet passes in an instant. I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, the soft rustling of her movements as she adjusted the thin fabric of my underwear. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, and I had no idea what to do. She was still professional, at least outwardly, but there was no mistaking the change in the atmosphere. It was thick, charged with something I didn't fully understand yet. Her fingers moved again, this time brushing against me in a way that felt far more deliberate, far more intimate than I'd expected. The room seemed smaller, the walls closer, and every second that passed made it harder to focus on anything but her touch. "Just relax," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper now, as if we were sharing a secret. But the way she said it, the way her eyes flicked to mine with that same unspoken intensity, told me there was nothing relaxing about this moment. My body responded in ways I couldn't control, a slow burn of heat building inside me as her fingers moved with practiced ease. I could not help the way my breath quickened, the way my muscles tensed under her touch. Her eyes met mine again, and this time there was no mistaking the look in them. It was a look I had seen before, but never in a setting like this. It was desire, plain and simple, and it was mutual. My heart raced, pounding against my ribcage as the tension between us continued to grow, thickening the air until it felt like we were the only two people in the world. She leaned in, her lips just inches from my ear, her breath warm and soft against my skin. I could feel the anticipation building inside me, a slow, steady pulse that was becoming impossible to ignore. Her voice was so soft, so intimate, as if we had already crossed some invisible line, one that I did not even realize we were approaching. I could feel her breath on my neck, warm and inviting, as her fingers worked their way lower, brushing against me with a touch that was anything but clinical. I struggled to stay still, to keep my composure, but the closeness of her body, the warmth of her touch, it was too much. My breath came out in short, shallow bursts as I tried to ignore the way my body was reacting to her, but it was impossible. Every part of me was alive with sensation, with the slow, deliberate movements of her hands and the heat of her body so close to mine. "You are responding well," she whispered, her breath hot against my skin, and I felt a surge of something I couldn't quite name, a thrill, a deep desire that had been buried but now was rising to the surface. Her lips brushed against the side of my neck, just the faintest touch, but it sent a shockwave through me, making my body tense with need. I couldn't hold back the soft groan that escaped me as her fingers pressed more insistently against me, her touch growing bolder by the second. I knew we were crossing into dangerous territory, but it felt like we were both too far gone to stop. She moved in closer, her body now pressed against mine, and I could feel every curve, every soft line of her as she leaned into me. The scent of her perfume was intoxicating, filling my senses and clouding any judgment I had left. My pulse was racing, my body reacting in ways I couldn't control, and I knew she could feel it too. "You are making this hard to resist," I murmured, my voice strained, thick with the tension that had been building between us. She smiled, her lips barely grazing my ear. "I am not trying to resist anymore," she replied, her voice low and filled with a kind of need that matched my own. There was no hesitation in her words, no second guessing. We were both far beyond that now. Her fingers slid lower, brushing against me with a purpose that sent a rush of heat through my entire body. I could feel the intensity of her touch, the way her hand moved with such confidence, like she knew exactly what she was doing. It was impossible to think, to focus on anything but her. Her breath on my skin, her hand exploring with a deliberate slowness that made every second feel like an eternity. I swallowed hard, trying to catch my breath, but it was no use. I was too caught up in the moment, in the way she made me feel, in the way my body was responding to her every touch. Her lips brushed against my jaw, and I could not stop myself from turning toward her, capturing her lips in a kiss that was soft at first, hesitant, but quickly deepened as the desire between us boiled over. It was like a dam breaking, all the tension and heat we had been holding back, now released in a wave of raw, uncontrollable need. Her hands were everywhere, exploring, teasing, and I could feel the heat building inside me, an overwhelming intensity that I could not ignore. The sterile, cold exam room faded into the background, replaced by the warmth of her body pressed against mine, the intoxicating closeness of her lips on my skin. Her breath hitched as my hands found her waist, pulling her closer, needing to feel her, needing more. The soft fabric of her scrubs did nothing to hide the curves of her body as she pressed against me, her breath ragged as her lips left a trail of kisses down my neck. "I have wanted this since the moment you walked in," she whispered, her voice a mix of desire and urgency. Her confession sent a thrill through me, and I could not stop myself from leaning in, kissing her again, harder this time, more insistent, more desperate. Her hands moved with more urgency now, her fingers tracing the waistband of my underwear, and I knew there was no turning back. My heart pounded as her lips found mine again, the kiss deepening with each passing second. The room felt too small, too intimate, the air between us thick with the weight of everything that was happening, everything that had been building since the moment she walked back into that room. Her touch was driving me insane, her fingers pressing harder, more insistently, as she explored every inch of my skin. I could feel the heat pooling in my stomach, a slow burn that was quickly becoming impossible to ignore. She was everywhere. Her hands, her lips, her breath, all of it overwhelming my senses, making it impossible to think of anything else but the way she made me feel. The way my body responded to her touch, to the soft sounds of her breath against my ear, to the way she whispered my name in that hushed, breathless tone. It was all too much, and I was losing control. I could feel the tension inside me coiling tighter and tighter, ready to snap, and I knew I was close, so close. Her lips moved from my mouth to my neck, leaving a trail of heated kisses that made my skin tingle with anticipation. My breathing grew more ragged, more desperate, as I pulled her even closer, unable to resist the pull between us any longer. "You like this, do not you?" she murmured against my ear, her breath hot, teasing, as her hand moved lower, more purposefully now. I could not answer, could not find the words, because everything in me was focused on her, on the way her touch sent waves of pleasure through my entire body. All I could do was nod, my body trembling under her hands, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Her lips brushed against my jaw again, softer this time, almost tender, as her hand continued its slow, agonizing exploration. She knew exactly what she was doing, every touch driving me further to the edge of something I had no control over. And I knew, as I looked into her eyes, that she wanted this just as much as I did. Her lips were so close to mine, her breath mingling with my own, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. The clinic, the exam, all of it faded away, and all I could think about was her. Her touch, her breath, her body pressed against mine. I was lost in the moment, in the heat that had been building between us, and there was no pulling back now. She leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft at first, but quickly grew more urgent, more intense. Her hand moved lower, sliding beneath the waistband of my underwear, and I felt a surge of electricity course through me, my body responding instantly to her touch. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse racing as her fingers explored, teasing me with a confidence that made my head spin. The air around us was thick with anticipation, every second stretching out as the tension between us built to an almost unbearable level. My hands tightened on her waist, pulling her even closer, needing to feel every inch of her against me. Her body pressed against mine, warm and soft, and I could feel the heat radiating from her. The way her breath hitched as her fingers moved more deliberately now, more insistent. "You are driving me crazy," I whispered, my voice rough, strained with the tension that had been building inside me. She smiled against my skin, her lips grazing my neck as her hand moved with a slow, agonizing rhythm that had me teetering on the edge. "Good," she whispered back, her breath hot against my ear, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, the pleasure she took in the way my body responded to her every touch. Her lips found mine again, this time with a hunger that sent a wave of heat through my entire body. I kissed her back, harder now, my pulse racing as her hand continued to move, sending wave after wave of pleasure through me. It was impossible to think of anything else but her. Her touch, her breath, the way her body felt pressed so tightly against mine. I could feel the tension inside me coiling tighter, every second bringing me closer to the edge. She knew it too. I could tell by the way her fingers moved, the way her body pressed even closer, as if she could feel the same burning need that had consumed me. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as the intensity between us grew, the heat building to a breaking point. Her hand slid lower, her touch more insistent now, and I knew I was close. So close. My entire body trembled under her hands, my muscles tensing as the heat between us became unbearable. She leaned in closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "Let go. I want to feel it." That was all it took. With a soft groan, I felt the tension snap inside me, waves of pleasure crashing over me as I gave in completely, losing myself in the moment, in her. My entire body tensed, my breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts as I surrendered to the intensity of it all. She held me close through it, her hand still moving, coaxing me through the release, her lips pressing soft kisses to my neck, my jaw, my lips. As the last tremors of pleasure washed over me, I felt her hand finally still, resting gently on my stomach as she leaned into me, her breath warm and steady against my skin. We stayed like that for a long moment, neither of us speaking, the air around us filled with a quiet intimacy that hadn't been there before. My heart pounded in my chest, my body still trembling from the intensity of what had just happened. She stayed close, her fingers tracing light patterns across my chest as I tried to catch my breath, my mind reeling from the suddenness of it all. Her eyes met mine, and there was a softness there, a tenderness that made my chest tighten. We did not need to speak, did not need to say a word to understand what had just passed between us. For a long moment, the world outside that tiny exam room seemed to fade away, and it was just the two of us, tangled in each other, caught in the aftermath of something we had not seen coming but could not resist. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I should not have done that," she whispered, though there was no regret in her tone, only the weight of what had just happened between us. I shook my head, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I do not regret it," I said quietly, and it was the truth. Despite everything, despite how unexpected it had all been, I could not bring myself to regret a single second of it. The way she had touched me, the way she had made me feel, it was something I had not even known I needed until it happened. Her lips curved into a small, soft smile, and she leaned in, pressing one last kiss to my lips, gentle and lingering. "Neither do I," she whispered, her breath warm against my skin. The tension that had filled the room earlier had dissolved completely, replaced by a warmth that settled between us, unspoken but understood. We stayed like that for a while longer, her body still pressed against mine, her hand resting on my chest as we both came down from the high. Eventually, she pulled away, straightening her clothes, her movements slow and deliberate. I sat up, watching her, my heart still racing in my chest as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She glanced back at me, her eyes soft, but there was something else there too. Something that told me this moment between us had changed things, maybe more than either of us realized. "I guess I will see you next time," she said with a small smile, her voice teasing. But there was a flicker of something deeper in her gaze. I nodded, returning her smile, though I knew that things would not be the same the next time I walked into that clinic. Not after this. We had crossed a line, one we could never go back from. As she opened the door to leave, she looked back one last time, her eyes lingering on mine for just a second longer than they should have. And then she was gone, the door clicking softly behind her, leaving me alone in the sterile, cold room that now felt a whole lot smaller than it had when I first walked in. But the air still buzzed with the electricity of what had just happened. And I knew that no matter what, nothing would ever be the same again.